Okay, why don't we get started? As I said, my name is Stefan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program here at UCSD. And before we introduce our speaker this afternoon, Hazel Smith, who's done the service of staying up to midnight in Britain to actually do this, we're particularly appreciative, Hazel, that you did this. I just wanted to give you a heads up about a number of Korea events that are coming up here, because we really have a embarrassment of riches. Curtis, can you give us the next slide? Yeah. So next Monday, February 13th, we've got this extraordinary grouping of scholars and practitioners and people in the humanitarian space who work on North Korea. The National Committee on North Korea is having its West Coast meeting here. And we're going to have a roundtable that afternoon, late afternoon, that includes a number of kind of top North Korea policy makers and watchers. Allison Hooker actually staffed the Singapore and Hanoi summits for the Trump administration. She's going to give a kind of lead off. Jeffrey Lewis is one of the top people on missiles and nuclear weapons issues. He founded Arms Control Wonk. He's up at Monterey. Jean Lee, who's at the Woodrow Wilson International Centers for Scholars, actually opened the AP's bureau in Pyongyang and has this wonderful podcast called The Lazarus Heist on crypto activities of the North Koreans. And Scott Snyder is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which has written extensively on the alliances. So I've put that event in the chat. That'll be live. I think we're not going to record that. So if you're interested in joining that program, please sign up and register. And then also next week, we have a visiting PLF fellow. Jong-hwa Lee is a professor at Korea University. He's dean of one of the graduate schools. He's been a senior advisor to several governments on Korea's international economic policies. And so he'll be talking to us about whether this is still the Asian century. And then finally, later in the month, we're really happy to have Ed Goldring, who teaches in the Department of Politics at York University, who's visiting us this year as a Korea Pacific Program fellow. And he's been doing this really first-rate research on purges in socialist systems with some very interesting data from North Korea. That'll also be a live event on the 27th at 5 o'clock. So mark that on your calendars. Okay, well, now to the main event. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Hazel Smith. When I was just getting started in my work on North Korea with Marcus Noland, Hazel had already been at this business for well over a decade, probably more. Professor Smith got her PhD at the London School of Economics. She's currently a professorial research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies at, is at the University of London, correct? And has worked for a number of UN bodies. She spent 2 years in Pyongyang. She's in high demand on the media. She does consulting for governments, including the South Korean government. She's written extensively on North Korea, and one book in particular that I'd like to bring to your attention, if you're looking for a good one-volume introduction, Hazel's North Korea Markets and Military Rule is as good a place to start as any, in my view. But I asked her on the webinar tonight because in 2020, she published a very interesting piece in Critical Asian Studies that I thought did something that very little of the research on sanctions has tackled, which is how to think about the ethics of sanctions in North Korea. Not just the question of their effectiveness, whether they work or don't work, whether they're misguided in that regard, but how to think about the ethical dilemmas of an extraordinarily weak government, a challenged human security situation, and then piling sanctions on top of that, and under what conditions we might be willing to do that. Hazel, their usual norm here is we just really stop at an hour, but we want you to talk as long as you feel appropriate. So why don't you start, and I'll ask you a few questions, and we'll get Lainey and Ed and some of the others in on the call.
Thank you, Stefan. And I'll try to be very disciplined and try to keep this to 30 minutes so that we can have enough time for a discussion. Many, many thanks for inviting me. I thank Stefan in particular. I wish I was over there in San Diego, one of my favorite cities in the States, but there you go, I'm over in the northeast of England instead, which Stefan knows well. I'm going to talk through a paper which, as Stefan says, I published a couple of years ago, but which the research area I've been working on for a while. And I'm pleased to talk to all of you, but it's very nice for me to be able to talk to students, some of you who will be familiar with the theoretical areas and the ethical reasoning which I've used in this paper, which are the sorts of things that you'll be learning about if you study IR and you're studying IPE as well. So it's great for me, and I appreciate your feedback, because I don't very often get the chance to have feedback from scholars and students. I really appreciate it these days. Now, I've asked Curtis, I wonder if you could bring up the first slide. So the analytical framework for, the second slide, sorry. Slide 2. Okay. The analytical framework for this piece starts off with a research question that if we accept that United Nations sanctions on North Korea are ethically justified because they're underpinned by a just cause, that's denuclearization, can we also argue that the means used, in this case sanctions, were also just? So that's how I've tried to focus the article, not to talk about everything under the sun, but that's my research question. So to take forward the argument, my piece utilizes fairly conventional moral reasoning via an analytical and theoretical structure derived from just war theory. And I'll go into that in a minute. The empirical underpinnings of the work are by and large derived from data sets or datum from the UN agencies, as well as specialist agencies of the United States and the South Korean government. And in this research, in fact, all of my work really, I don't use anonymous sources or speculation, opinion, or commentary to found what I hope will be credible in a scholarly manner. So that's the research questions. That's the sort of the reasoning part of it, and the chronological framing of the work was that I divided the period of UN sanctions on North Korea into two periods. The first is from when sanctions were initiated in 2006 to 2016. And these sanctions were largely targeted, and they targeted commodities, individuals, and institutions linked to the missile and nuclear program. But from 2016, the 2016 and 2017 sanctions, which govern the sanctions procedures that we have today on North Korea, these were comprehensive sanctions in that they were designed to limit the country's foreign exchange earnings, curtail many North Korean imports, irrespective of whether the commodities importers and or exporters were directly associated with the nuclear and missile program or not. And they were also comprehensive in that they did not exclude any part of the economy from those sanctions. So it didn't exclude the food economy or public health or education. So there were two different sorts of sanctions. Now, one of the things that I do, the reason that I'm using ethical criteria to assess sanctions and not legal criteria, and I wonder if we can go on to the next slide here, Curtis. And the next one after that. Okay, the reason I'm not using legal criteria, and again, this is a framework focus question to assess the sanctions, is that many of you will know, those that have studied international relations in particular, that international humanitarian law, which we know is codified in the Geneva Conventions, governs the conduct of war, but there is no authoritative international legislation analogous to the Geneva Conventions that can hold external actors to account if their actions negatively impact innocents, what are called innocents in international humanitarian law in another country in peacetime. It just doesn't exist. I mean, one legal commentator has noted that most people would be materially better off in occupied territory during or after a war than in a country which faces comprehensive sanctions. Now, again, before I go on to the analogies that I'm using when I'm looking at just war, just to say that international humanitarian law, which governs the conduct of war, is both very broad. We all know, either intuitively or because we've read the conventions, that there is just a complete prohibition on the targeting of non-combatants in war. But the Geneva Conventions also include a lot of detail, and relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today is Article 54, is it on this slide, of the 1977 Additional Protocol, Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. And I want to read this to you, even though it's a bit wordy, because it is going to be relevant to what I want to talk about when I'm talking about the impact of sanctions on North Korea and their ethical legitimacy. Now, that article states that it is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And remember, this is in the enemy state, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, drinking water installations and supplies and irrigation works, for the purpose of denying them for their sustenance value to the civilian population or to the adverse party, which is the government, whatever the motive, whether in order to starve out civilians or to cause them to move away or for any other motive. Now, in the Geneva Conventions, if those activities take place in war, they are war crimes. Those activities constitute war crimes. So just to have that framework for the Geneva Conventions, which cover the conduct of war, what you can do legitimately and ethically and legally in war, remembering that in peacetime, there are no similar protections for civilians in enemy or adversary countries. So when we go on to look at just war theory, and if we can look at the next slide, one of the reasons that I refer to IHL, International Humanitarian Law, is because it's underpinned by just war theory. That's the international humanitarian law that I've spoken about, that is set out in the Geneva Conventions, is underpinned very specifically by just war theory. So in the absence of a legal framework for thinking about the impact of sanctions on the population in an adversary country, many scholars use the just war theory as an analogy to assess the legitimacy of sanctions. And again, a number of you will know this through your research, but just war theory has two components. One is the Latin jus ad bellum, which concerns the criteria of why we go to war. Is there a just cause? You know, if a nation, if another country attacks the United States, it has a just cause to go to war. Jus in bello, by contrast, concerns the criteria for how the ethical criteria for what's admissible when we fight or conduct war. Now, there's a lot of literature on this, and my next slide, if we can go to the next slide, for those of you that are students in IR or IPE, or even those that you're interested, I would commend these books to you. Michael Walzer, who's a very senior professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, really wrote the definitive book on just and unjust wars, even though it was published in 1977. But for those of you interested in the relationship of sanctions to just and unjust war theory, Cecile Fabre's book, which I drew on quite a lot, is very useful. And for those of you that are interested in how these theories have been applied to other sanctions episodes, particularly Iraq and Haiti, Joy Gordon at Loyola University has done a lot of work on this, and you can just Google her, you'll find the work online. So I haven't invented anything new here, except in relationship to thinking about the sanctions on North Korea. So I'm going to, because I'm going to accept that, although I think there is an argument which I'm not making, that the cause is just, that the reason for going for implementing sanctions on North Korea is just the cause of denuclearization. I intend to focus, and I did focus in this article that Stefan referred to, on the conduct the means by which we implement the policy towards the aim of achieving denuclearization. And so for that, I drew on the very conventional jus in bello criteria. And can we take the next slide here? Bruno, can we, Curtis, sorry. No, the one before that. Right, the standard criteria, again, I'm not inventing anything. Those of you that have read a bit of Thucydides, you will also be able to look at this in terms of the sanctions that are supposed to have kicked off the long Second Peloponnesian War. But the standard criteria for jus in bello are effectiveness. And as in all things, those of you, again, that are studying international relations will realize that some of the vocabulary used in IR theory or in the profession means something some vocabulary means something quite specific, like anarchy is the classic one in international relations. Anarchy, if you're studying international relations, will usually be referring to no central government, whereas anarchy in the world in which we have conversations usually refers to chaos. It's similar when we're looking at moral reasoning and just war theory. So the three criteria for are effectiveness, necessity, and proportionality. And the reason I put these up here is that so you can take a look at these, because these three criteria relate to quite specific issues. Effectiveness, I'm quoting here, is from Fabre, I think, but I can get the original quote for anybody who would like it. Effectiveness is about imposing a defensive or a deterrent cost on others, and that this is justified only if it stands a reasonable chance of success of parrying the threat to which it is response. So in other words, you make an assessment at the beginning, is there a reasonable chance that what I'm doing in terms of imposing these sanctions is going to achieve the goal of denuclearization? So that's the first one, effectiveness. Necessity. Sanctions, of course, are used in, what we're talking about is when they're used in place of war, not in addition to war. There are some occasions when sanctions are used in addition to war. But when sanctions are used in place of war, the necessity criterion means that other means of trying to achieve your goal must have been tried. And in international relations, that normally means that all means of diplomacy must have been exhausted. And the third criterion is proportionality. The harm caused to innocents must not be disproportionate to the aims of sanctions. Innocents can be children, the sick, those who don't benefit from the government, basically the civilian population who are not actively involved in the government. And we should also note that only one of these three criterion need to be breached for an assessment of unethical conduct as far as the classical just war criteria are concerned. So that's the overall framework of this piece. So what about the specific argument of my piece? Well, as I said, in this piece, I assume that the jus ad bellum criteria are fulfilled, in that the denuclearization objective can be reasonably understood as non-controversial ethically. I also assume, although I think there's an argument on this, but I also assume that up until 2016, remember I said I divide the sanctions into two periods, the ethical underpinnings of UN policy in terms of sanctions policy were reasonably secure, because at least the jus in bello criteria were nominally adhered to. I think there is an argument, I mean, that the policy, well, we know the policy was not effective, whether it could have been foreseeably not effective. I think there is an argument that it was very foreseeable that it wasn't going to be effective, but leaving that aside, and also leaving aside the necessity condition, which was all diplomacy tried, and some diplomacy was tried, not by the UN, but by the US and others over the period. So we can argue that the necessity condition was fulfilled in that period. We can also argue, and again, I'm not making that argument here, and I don't have to, I'm just framing what I'm going to be talking about here, that in that period of targeted sanctions, the policy was reasonably proportionate in that it was targeted at commodities, persons, and institutions linked to the North Korea's nuclear and defense program. But my argument, the core of this argument, which I processed through this article in presenting, is that the UN sanctions policy remained ineffective in that it didn't achieve the aims of denuclearization. North Korea remains a nuclear power. And I would argue, although again, I don't have to make that argument because of the other arguments I'm going to make, that that could have been reasonably foreseen at the beginning of all of the sanctions episode. I think I argue also that fulfillment of the necessity condition remains arguable. And for my argument here, I don't have to demonstrate whether it was or wasn't. But what I can, and I hope I do demonstrate this article, is that the proportionality criteria of the 2016 and 17 sanctions was not adhered to, so that even if the debate over the effectiveness and necessity conditions remains unresolved, post-2016 sanctions were disproportionate in that they, and again, I'm going to quote the terminology of the sanctions literature, they recklessly and negligently imposed harm without paying attention to innocence. In empirical terms, what I want to focus on here is food security. The foreseeable and actual result of the 2016 and 17 sanctions were drastic reductions in agricultural production in 2018, the reintroduction of chronic food shortages from 2019 onwards, and the reintroduction of starvation, particularly for those who got the least help from the government. I don't know if I'll have time to follow it through as well, but if I can, I will also be saying, I want to show that the claim sometimes made that the UN Security Council has no ethical responsibilities for the population of North Korea cannot be sustained. So let's go into the empirical bit now. The 2016 and 17 sanctions, they were comprehensive. They didn't exclude any economic sector, including agriculture, the food economy, public services. Trade sanctions were particularly severe. They included an almost total export ban. The US Department of State's reports that in September 2017, over 90% of North Korea's reported exports were now banned. The December 2017 resolution, the last one, expanded the export bans to include capture the remaining, or most of the remaining 10%. Import bans included an outright ban on all vehicles of any sort, all metals, which is one of the reasons why blood pressure machines are not allowed into North Korea today, because it includes metals, machinery, natural gas, plus others. So it's very broad import bans which affected every part of the economy. Oil imports were not banned, but they were severely restricted, so that by December 2017, the import quota allowed to North Korea of refined petroleum, including diesel, was 500,000 barrels a year. And we should note that that is less than South Korea uses in one day. So this is an extreme import restrictions. North Korea doesn't produce its own oil, so of course it relied on imports. It's also worth noting that these UN oil sanctions were not introduced to tackle defense-related oil products, such as missile fuel, as these were already covered by other bans in place before the sanctions. So the economic context, you will all know, North Korea is a poor country. In 2019, the CIA ranked the DPRK at 215 out of 229 countries in terms of GDP per capita. The only other countries poorer were Comoros, Sierra Leone, Madagascar, Eritrea, South Sudan, Liberia, Yemen, Malawi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Central African Republic. So no doubt that North Korea is a poor country. So what was the impact on food production of these extended sanctions? Now, North Korea, like every other nation that engages in agricultural production, and any of you here who are in the audience or listening who comes from a farming area or a farming or the Midwest or who knows anything about farming will know that all agricultural production above subsistence level relies on oil products and natural gas. It does all sorts of things, produces fertilizer, helps produce fertilizer, pesticides, agricultural chemicals, plastics, powers irrigation pumps, machinery for drying crops before storage, heating buildings and greenhouses, most of all, of course, transport of seeds, food, labor, powering agricultural machinery. So because agriculture, which in North Korea is more or less the same as food production, in the United States, it's not the same because of the cotton crops and other crops that are grown, so that agriculture comprises food and non-food production. But in North Korea, the agricultural sector is basically food production. And it constitutes about a third of the economy, however measured, if you include things like the fertilizer production, the transport relevant to agriculture. So with economy-wide sanctions of 2016 and 17, with no civilian sector exempt, it was pretty logical that if agriculture comprises about 30% of the economy, that agriculture and therefore food production would be negatively impacted. What does that mean for food security? Well, in some countries it wouldn't. It would mean less if you had a lot of imports. But in food imports in North Korea, domestic food production, which was rebuilt after the famine of the 1990s, which all of you will know killed around 500,000 North Koreans, and which had also actually been precipitated by the cutoff of trade with China and the former Soviet Union, and a consequent rapid fall in domestic food production in the 1990s. But after the famine of the 1990s, domestic food production was rebuilt, so that between 2008 and 2018, most of the 26 million population were fed from domestic food production. And in that period, there was a fairly manageable food import requirement of about 500,000 tons a year during that period. There was limited food aid, but not much. North Korea didn't rely on food aid in that period. And this was a successful policy in terms of food security, because we know that by 2017, child malnutrition in North Korea was much better than in 1998, and also better than many other countries in Asia, not Japan and South Korea, of course, but in other poorer countries and indeed some wealthy countries in Asia. So if we can go to the next slide, please, slide 8. Okay. And what we can see here, they're really basically, I put 2 slides in one, which is something you should never do as a teacher. So I apologize for doing it. The top bit of it shows, and all these figures are from UNICEF, and you can also find them, I think, on the World Bank data sets. In 1998, stunting, which is when you have a low height for age, and it means that you haven't had enough food so that your growing is stunted, in North Korea was measured at about 64%. The quality of these nutrition surveys improved as we got to 2017, but still, given that that was still in the famine years, really, that wouldn't have been surprising. Wasting, which is a nutritional term which is used to describe when you're so malnourished that you will die if you don't get medical help as well as food, was 21%. You can see from that top line, 1998, 64% and 21%. Now you can see that the malnutrition figures improve in that they decrease, so that by 2017, which was the last of the nutrition surveys, stunting overall in North Korea was 19% and wasting was 3%. Still far too much, still a horrible situation, but it had improved. And if we compare other reasonably well-off countries in Asia, well, Nepal isn't, but India and the Philippines perhaps are, again, what was surprising to me when I first came across this data was that if I used the latest figures that I could, that's for the Nepal, India, Pakistan, and Philippines, and I haven't looked this week, so there may be further updates. But if you look at Nepal, India, Pakistan, and Philippines in between 2016 and 2018, stunting is much higher, or was much higher then, than in North Korea in 2017. And wasting in Nepal in 2016 was 10%. In India, 21%, Pakistan 7% in 2018, and Philippines 7%. So what this tells us is that on average, a North Korean child was better off in nutritional terms than if they lived in Nepal, India, Pakistan, or Philippines. Now, we know quite a lot actually about food production in North Korea between 2008, in the 1990s, early 2000s, and we know quite a bit about imports. So most of that improvement, whether the food was delivered through the market or through the government, came from food that was grown in North Korea. And in fact, the market in that period allowed for a more agile allocation and distribution of food. There was a marketization after the famine. But the main point that whether food was distributed through markets or the government, there still had to be enough grown or available through imports to distribute. So marketization didn't solve the problem of the underlying dependence of North Korean food production on oil and technology imports. So we still had the underlying problem for food to be grown, in North Korea, whether it was distributed through the market or the government, you required oil. Now, after the implementation of the 2017 sanctions, 2016 and 17 sanctions, in 2018, there was a very large fall in agricultural output, in agricultural production. Now, the order of magnitude, I've got all the data in the article, which you might have a look at. I've got other data, which I'm happy to share with people, but the order of magnitude of fall in food production in 2018, and food production in any one year is what gets eaten at the following year. So that would affect what was available for consumption in 2019. So the order of magnitude of fall in food production in 2018 had not been seen since at least 2004-05. And depending on the comparability criteria utilised, maybe since the famine years of the 1990s. And since then, and I've got the figures for 2019, 2020, 2021, not yet for 2022, there has only been enough food produced to feed, again on average, 18 million of the 26 million population at the most basic survival rations. Of course, we know that all food isn't divided equally everywhere, but that shows you the extent of the food shortage. Now, in terms of the sanctions and agricultural collapse, in May 2019, the World Food Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization, and these organizations had worked in North Korea for 20 years, inside reported that, I quote, the unintended negative impact sanctions can have on agricultural production through both direct and indirect impacts cannot be ignored. The most obvious are restrictions on the importation of certain items that are necessary for agricultural production, in particular fuel, machinery, and spare parts for equipment. In June 2019, Thomas Ojea Quintana, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in North Korea, stated that, in my view, the sanctions regime is having a detrimental impact on the livelihood of North Koreans. Now, again, none of this really should be a surprise. If you target an entire economy, you don't exclude agriculture, you don't exclude food production, and if 26 million people depend on local food production, those who are not rich or privileged will suffer. Those who are the most vulnerable, the poorest, the sickest, will suffer the most, and people will starve, again, the most vulnerable, if they can't get hold of food. And we know that because we saw it happening in the 1990s. So to go back to just war, and I'll try and do this in a couple of minutes, just war analogies do not assume that sanctions are illegitimate if innocents are harmed. Just war analogies, don't assume that that means that sanctions would be unethical. Just war models, in fact, assume that sanctions always cause harm to innocents. If you think about it, they must do. You wouldn't have sanctions that just affect, comprehensive sanctions, one bit of the populations. All actions in response to wrongdoing, including doing nothing, have the potential to inflict harm on innocents. The question then for just war theory is the acceptable level of harm. So if we look back at the criteria that we use to assess the ethics of the conduct of sanctions, the implementation of sanctions, I would argue that it could have been reasonably expected that comprehensive sanctions would not achieve the aim of denuclearization. And I don't talk about that here because I haven't got the time, but that doesn't just involve knowing anything about the North Korean government. But if you look at all the sanctions literature, which is immense, there isn't really a record, either historically or empirically or theoretically, analytically, of comprehensive sanctions on their own without war or diplomacy having achieved policy aims. Arguably, the necessity criterion became increasingly strained, especially after the failed Hanoi summit with Donald Trump in 2019. But decisively for me, irrespective of whether we argue that effectiveness and necessity it was justified, the implementation of comprehensive sanctions breached the proportionality principle. Food production was not exempt from the expanded sanctions, and the direct result of these sanctions was to reintroduce the conditions of starvation into North Korea. One final point, of course, North Korea as a government has the primary responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. But ethically, that doesn't mean that any means may be employed by external actors, as we've seen in the Geneva Conventions in terms of war, to affect the civilian population. Cecile Fabre, in one of the books that I mentioned earlier, comments that senders of sanctions, in this case the UN, bear sole responsibility for the costs that they impose, even if these costs can be traced to some anterior event for which other agents, in this case the North Korean government, are causally responsible. So I'd just like to sum up by saying the common sense ethical principle that two wrongs don't make a right, in other words, what the North Korean government does wrongly, which is much, which is a lot, two wrongs don't make a right. This ethical common sense principle can be appropriately applied to UN sanctions policy, comprehensive sanctions policy. I've got a bit more, but I'm going to end here, so I've got time for discussion.
Hazel, this vindicated my choice of you coming. I mean, I really wish you were out here to talk about this, because this is, I think it's just an incredibly rich and interesting paper. And I want to just get the conversation rolling by inviting anyone who's on the call to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll be able to relay those on. I'm going to get Ed and Delaney in a moment. But I want to start by just underlining one thing you said and then asking a question about the actual sanctions process. You note, I think one of the interesting things in your paper, which I would even emphasize more when you present this, is that even if the North Korean government is responsible, both over the long run by not adequately incentivizing agriculture, and in the short run by not taking actions to import more food, that in no way absolves the international actors from their responsibility. And in fact, the international actors, as I understand you, are required ethically to take into account the fact that North Korea is behaving in the way that it behaves. So that point at the end, I think, is extremely important for the overall argument. But the question I wanted to pose to you is to ask you, in a sense, to invert your paper, because your paper is a piece of critique. But my question is, what would an ethical sanctions regime on North Korea look like? Or is one possible given the vulnerability of the population and this problem which I just outlined to you? Now, perhaps you could just spend a minute talking about the exemptions process, because, I think the exemptions process is too slow and it's unwieldy, and it itself, in fact, is the source of some of these difficulties. But could you speak to what you think a sanctions regime might look like that was ethical?
Yeah. The first thing, unless it's an earthquake, as we've tragically seen in Turkey, where humanitarians work is where there are bad governments that don't deliver. So, but almost by definition, we are talking about a sanctions process on a bad government. And for me, that means that we should try to protect civilians who are already suffering from that bad government. So I don't know if that answers the first question, but I think we need to very carefully distinguish between the government and the population. 26 million, of course, the US is a big country, but it's the same size as Australia in population size. It's a biggish country. And I have been thinking about this issue of what would be an ethical sanctions regime. And some of it speaks to the minutiae of the humanitarian exemptions regime, which I don't think are commonly understood by those outside, outside those who are interested in looking through the nuts and bolts. I think a sanctions regime which broadly went back to the targeted sanctions could include parts of the 2016 and 17 regime, which refers to broad areas of import and export sanctions, but excluded sectors such as food production, health, education, and so that provided there'd be a multilateral process set up in the same way the CADO process, for instance, was set up. For goodness sake, the US and Japan were building nuclear reactors in North Korea in the 1990s, and it worked because there was a multilateral process which operated fairly effectively. There was millions going in, and so I think that that's worked before. There was a high level of scrutiny. So where certain, probably overseen by the South Korean, with the South Korean government having a big say in what goes on, because they would in the end be funding any projects. The South Korean government have the capacity and have had the willingness in the past, and may even have the willingness under President Yoon, to be supporting fairly big projects in North Korea if they felt that it wouldn't breach the sanctions regime, and if they felt it would benefit primarily the population or sectors of the population, as they did when they supported the Kaesong project, when they helped support water supply, water supply, income, electricity supply for those in the Kaesong area. It wasn't just that those are working in the Kaesong industrial zone, but families and communities. So if there were exemptions around sectors over which there was a multilateral scrutiny committee, which would necessarily have to involve the South Korean government, because they would be funding, maybe Japan, maybe the United States. I think that could work, that something could be worked out. The reason the humanitarian exemptions process cannot respond at the moment is that, and in previous sanction episodes, humanitarian exemptions procedures are set up in different ways. But in the DPRK sanctions, if you look, and it's all online, if you look at any of the projects that have been agreed for humanitarian exemptions, for instance, a small health project, every single item down to the nails, how many nails, if you have a packet of nails of 6 nails, has to have a line item saying where it's coming from, how much it's going to cost, when it's going to go in the country, what metal is involved in it, who the supplier was. Now, on a very small project of a few $1,000s, you'd be talking about 60 or 100,000 bits of data that have to be filled in for that project to even be seen, never mind approved. It's all online. I mean, and it's simply designed to stop. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier, If you have a blood pressure machine, that has to be, and more than one, you have to declare two. There has to be a whole line item for that. It has to say what metal is involved in it, where it comes from, where it's bought from, who's buying it. You have to assure on the line, you have to say that it's going to be in the country within 3 months or 6 months. I think it is 3 months or 6 months, where it's going, what are the contraindications? Could the blood pressure machine be used to hit somebody over the head, you know, if there was a conflict, I presume. It sounds ridiculous, but that's the system as it works now. That almost any item that you like to think of, whether it's a cabinet to hold blood, has to go through that process because a glass cabinet will have metal on it. That means you cannot apply for humanitarian exemptions unless you've got millions of dollars behind you. And I think the 4 or 5 that have been successful have been UN organizations that have probably spent as much on the process as they have on the project. Well, there was a US Christian, I think it's the Korean Christian Friends of Korea, one non-UN project that's gone through. So it is possible, I think, to devise a system which would fine-tune a sanctions regime, but which would have a targeted exemption regime, which would work, in my view.
Sorry, I have a lot more to ask you, but I want to get Ed and Lainey in. Ed, do you want to unmute, and do you have anything you might like to pose?
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much, Hazel. Really interesting. And just to echo the point, strongly recommend people read the article in Critical Asian Studies. So this, I think this builds on the last question a little bit, but based on your argument, correct me if I'm misquoting you, but the point that a comprehensive set of sanctions will almost inevitably, by definition, I think you said, will impact the civilian population negatively in some way. So are there ever ethical grounds on which a comprehensive set of sanctions can be justified towards North Korea?
Well, it depends how they're implemented. If you have exemptions, such as the ones I talked about, you could argue that you were paying attention to innocence. That's what the ethical criteria allows for. It would be a harder job to argue that they were of themselves unethical, that they did not adhere to the proportionality criteria, if you could show that they were systematically taking account into the impact on innocence. It doesn't have to be the impact on every innocent, because as I said, all just war criteria, or the just war analogy for sanctions, and even just war criteria that underpins the Geneva Conventions, understands and allows for innocence that will be impacted. But what it says is that innocence can't be targeted, and proper attention must be given to protecting innocence. And innocence in the terminology in war means non-combatants on the whole, prisoners of war. In sanctions, it applies to children, the sick, people with disabilities, basically those that are not, that don't benefit from the government. And we know that, because we know that North Korea is a bad government, that most North Koreans don't actually benefit from the government. So yes, I think it is possible to devise a sanctions regime. We might have to change the categorization we use, because at the moment we do tend to use either targeted or comprehensive sanctions, because we haven't actually, at least in the UN, and as far as my knowledge from the sanctions literature, we haven't devised, there hasn't been a system which has looked at very broad sanctions, but with very specific exemptions that pay attention to protecting innocence, which could be something that could be devised, in my view.
Thanks.
Great. I want to come back to the proportionality question, but Lainey, do you have a question you'd like to pose?
I was having is, how do you get organizations like the UN and humanitarian regimes to avoid unethical sanctions in this case? How do you incentivize organizations around the world, or get them to reform or change in the ways you're suggesting?
Well, I think the UN humanitarian agencies, and remember the UN's a big conglomerate, and even the Security Council, I work closely with UN officials in the agencies and in the Security Council, are very aware that the sanctions as implemented right now are harming those that it shouldn't be harming. But it's a political decision. So this is a decision for member states on the Security Council. And then you get into, there are two things. One is there's a decision for member states on the Security Council. And the other is that there is a bureaucratic process, and particularly in the United States, because it's the United States Treasury that's been taking the lead on the comprehensive sanctions. If you look at the draft notes that went in, some in the Treasury, and again, I work very closely with US agencies in DC. Recently, I did something with the Defense Intelligence Agency in the DIA, which Marcus was actually at.
I was on that call too.
You were going to be there, but Stefan. And it's such a huge bureaucratic process in the States in terms of dealing with North Korea. It's not like in the UK or even the European Union, where it's there's lots and lots of different agencies in DC dealing with North Korea. And I think there's a number of agencies, State Department officials working there who understand North Korea very well and who understand the impact that these comprehensive sanctions are having on civilians. Now we've got enough data on the food production to know that. But there is a logjam inside Treasury in terms of, in my view, from my looking at it from the outside and a little bit on the inside, that it's easy to put on sanctions. It's hard to take them off, because to take them off bureaucratically involves an unrolling of a bureaucratic process, which in a bureaucratic structure is difficult to do. So you've got that. You've got the UN Security Council, which really is leaving it to the United States to take it would be the United States that would have to take the lead on doing this, because China and Russia would want to change. Britain would go along with the US because its policy on North Korea in the UK, in the Security Council, is that it sees the partnership with the US as more important than the North Korea policy, so it would likely follow that. The bandwidth in Washington, in my view, does not put North Korea right now at the top of the agenda. So there's not really much incentive for rethinking what's going on there now. There's not much publicity about the impact on sanctions, and there's a reason for that. One is that the North Korean government itself doesn't want to admit its economic frailties, refuses to admit that sanctions have had any impact on its economy, that it's all self-help and, and also those in the Security Council, those officials that may know about the impact on of the broader sanctions on citizens, don't really want to say that out loud, because it's not really good for democratic countries to be facilitating starvation. So there's and of course, since COVID, when the North Korean government closed its borders in 2020, there's not been an ability for international agencies to go in and to be reporting back on what they're seeing. So there's a conglomeration of circumstances as to why that logjam can't be broken, even though I think nowadays there are many officials in the US where it counts that understand the impact.
Yeah, Hazel, listen, we need to try to you off to bed, because we know it's very late there, but we do have one question in the chat, and then I want to close.
I can go on forever. I had to sleep tonight.
Well, we might run over a few minutes. It's really our norm that we stop. But let me just ask you two more questions, and then you can take them. One of the people in the Q&A asks a question, which I'll paraphrase, which is that sanctions tend to incentivize black markets. And of course, you know and have written on how the process of what Marcus and I call marketization from below has been a crucial piece of the whole, North Korean economic history over the last 15 years. Can you speak to how that marketization process, the existence of gray and informal markets, plays into the story you're telling? Or does it have any effect on the logic that you've outlined for us? So that's one question. But my question is a second one, which is your proportionality criteria has an important implication, which is that the state of play with respect to vulnerable people in North Korea at any given moment determines what's proportional and disproportional. So if the population is healthier and better off, you can do one thing, but if the population is weaker and its capacities are diminished, then particular care is required under the ethical principles that you've outlined. So that means that what's going on in North Korea now matters for an empirical judgment of what sanctions regime is appropriate. So maybe you can close this out by taking a stab at those two questions. The first one I thought was interesting as well.
Okay, it's a very, I mean, if I was just looking at this in terms of analytical and theoretical understanding, North Korea is a very interesting case in terms of the impact of sanctions in their relationship to black markets. And we need to divide this into two. If we look at the external smuggling, criminal smuggling by the state, of course they're doing this, and they're trying to expand as all states do. There's no sanctions episodes that hasn't had smuggling in history. That's part of it, and we've got lots of evidence through the sanctions panels and elsewhere that the North Korean government is really trying to bypass sanctions, particularly in trying to get more oil deliveries. So in that sense, the sanctions have incentivized international smuggling, black markets. Internally, though, there's been, again, nobody's been in for the last 2 years, so I haven't got any empirical evidence, although direct empirical evidence I haven't been in. Internally, what it looks like is that the North Korean state has used this opportunity to try to eradicate domestic grey markets, and basically the state, what had been developing already before comprehensive sanctions as what I call mini chaebols, and the state had been taking over the large commercial firms who are engaged in the wholesale market that had been happening already. It looks like what the North Korean government is doing is expanding the remit of those state-led economic organizations which operate in the private sector abroad, they trade abroad, and trying to eradicate grey area black market activity internally, so that distribution of goods is only what they're trying to achieve is to go back in history, so that distribution of goods only comes through state outlets to try to make sure that grain, for instance, is no longer sold in the grey area economy. Now, I know that's what they've tried to do. What I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows in the scientific sense, is how much they've achieved that over the last 2 years. One of the problems with that is that those grey area markets were providing access to food for people that weren't getting it through government channels. So to the extent that that has been successful, then those people will be even more vulnerable, because there won't be very much in the state shops. What goes in the state shops will be allocated, or it'll be corruptly allocated, but it will be allocated also to priority groups, miners, the military, civil servants, the middle class in Pyongyang, not everybody in Pyongyang. And they'll have more difficulty getting access to the grey area markets, which they used to before. So there's been a two-pronged process, as far as I can see, in terms of the relationship to non-official trade and non-official markets. Definitely internationally grown, because it has to, because they can't import and export otherwise. But internally, the government's deliberately trying to close that down. I doubt if it's been possible, but I'm sure that it's caused a lot of difficulties for some people at different times. On the issue of proportionality, I think that's actually what it does imply, the issue of proportionality. In the end, the jus in bellum, the jus in bello criteria has always got to be empirically assessed. because that's just a framework to look at what's happening. So the empirical conditions in every single different sanctions episode will be different. I haven't made a study of how, in terms of comparison, what's happening in North Korea under sanctions, to say what happened although I've looked a bit at what happened to the Iraqi population and the literature on that under comprehensive sanctions, and the literature on what happened to Haiti under comprehensive sanctions in the 1990s. And there's a number of similarities. And the difference was they were more open, even though they were very, very difficult environments to work in. So you could get more data. But I think that does actually. I just would come back to the fact that say that these are simply a framework. You still have to do the empirical work. But the framework allows us to look at the empirical information in a way which I think hopefully is a good analytical framework, allows us to make more sense of the material. I don't know if that.
But I do think that to the extent that you're seeing an increase in distress as measured by things like food prices and the variability of food prices and so on, as well as other indicators, your argument would gain force, not lose force, with respect to the injunctions and the obligations of the international community in that setting. So, Hazel, look, this has really been terrific. Next time in San Diego, we hope. We really appreciate you staying up late. We'll send you the link and we'll distribute the link here so other people can see the conversation. Thanks to Ed and Lainey for joining us. And thanks to all who've gotten on the calls. Right. So long.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure, really.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.